He was 19 years old. He was a national wrestling champion. He had competed in international tournaments representing his country. Last Thursday, Saleh Mohammadi was hanged at dawn in an Iranian prison. He was not executed for killing anyone. He was executed for going out into the street to protest, for daring to raise his voice against a regime that was ruining his life. And it wasn't just him. That same day, 2 other young men were hanged alongside him, and the day before, another one. In total, at least 5 executions in a matter of days, all linked to the January protests. But there is something that makes this situation even more terrifying. According to human rights organizations, there are more than 100 people right now in Iran's prisons facing charges that carry the death penalty. And the regime has just demonstrated that its hand does not tremble when it comes to carrying out its threats. While the world talks about missiles and wars in the Indian Ocean, in Iran they are hanging 19-year-old boys on the gallows. And that is also part of this war. In fact, it might be the most important part. Today, we are going to talk about what is happening inside Iran, about the fear, about the prisoners, about those who are no longer here, and about what may come in the next few days. To understand the executions this week, you need to understand what happened in Iran in January, because everything is connected. At the end of December 2025, something broke in Iran. It wasn't a political event or a speech by an opposition leader. It was something much more basic and much more powerful. People could no longer pay their bills. The Iranian rial, the country's currency, had been in freefall for months. Inflation had skyrocketed. A major bank, Ayande Bank, had collapsed. The prices of basic goods rose every week. Many Iranians saw their life savings evaporate in a matter of months. And then the merchants of the Grand Bazaar in Tehran, one of the oldest and most important markets in Iran, and an institution that had historically been loyal to the regime, began to close their shops. That was the spark. The protests spread to more than 280 locations in 27 of the country's 31 provinces. It was the largest protest movement in Iran since the Islamic Revolution of 1979. What started as an economic complaint transformed into something deeper. People going out into the streets to directly call for the end of the regime, with chants of "death to the dictator," with images of the supreme leader burning in bonfires. The regime responded as it has always responded, with bullets. January 8th and 9th, 2026, were the bloodiest days. Security forces received orders, according to Iranian officials who spoke with international media, to shoot to kill. The internet was cut off on a massive scale so that the world could not see what was happening. The death toll figures are the subject of profound controversy. The Iranian government acknowledged more than 3,000 deaths. Time magazine published a figure of up to 30,000, citing Iranian health sources. The NGO Iran Human Rights documented more than 3,400 verified deaths. The UN Special Rapporteur on Iran pointed out that the real figure could exceed 5,000 victims. More than 50,000 people were detained. And among those detainees were the ones who appeared on the gallows this week. If this type of analysis helps you understand what is happening in the world, subscribe to the channel and turn on the bell. Here, we don't make noise. We provide information. We are going to put names and faces to what has happened this week, because these are not statistics. They are lives. Saleh Mohammadi, 19 years old. He turned 19 on March 11th. 8 days later, he was hanged. He was a wrestler, a member of the Iranian national wrestling team. He had represented his country in international competitions. He was the kind of athlete a country should be proud of. He was detained during the protests on January 8th in the city of Qom, south of Tehran. The regime accused him of having participated in the death of a police officer. According to his lawyer and human rights organizations, Saleh Mohammadi was tortured to make him confess. Amnesty International documented that he was denied an adequate defense. His lawyer tried to present surveillance camera footage to the court, which, according to the family, proved that he was not at the scene of the events. The court refused to admit it as evidence. The process was so fast that legal organizations described it as an extrajudicial execution disguised as a trial. The United States Department of State had expressly warned in January, in a public message on social media, that it urged Tehran to stop the execution of Saleh Mohammadi. Iran ignored it. On Thursday, March 19th, at dawn, he was hanged in the central prison of Qom. Mehdi Ghassemi and Saeed Davoudi. They were executed alongside Saleh Mohammadi in the same early morning, in the same prison. Mehdi Ghassemi was accused of carrying out operational activities in favor of Israel and the United States, and of inciting violence, an accusation that human rights organizations described as completely fabricated, without verifiable evidence. Saeed Davoudi was going to turn 22 on March 21st today. He was accused of killing 2 police officers with bladed weapons during the protests. His family and his defense denied the charges and denounced that the confession was obtained under coercion. All 3 were convicted under the charge of moharebeh. It is an Arabic term that in Iranian law means enmity against God, or waging war against God. It is the capital charge that the regime reserves for those it considers its worst enemies. And it is the charge they are using now against young people who went out to protest because they could not make ends meet. Daniel Karamati and Mohsen Azimnia. According to some sources, including the outlet Octiario, which cites documentation from human rights organizations, at least 2 more people were reportedly executed in connection with the protests on the same days, although official confirmation of all cases presents difficulties given the regime's hermeticism. Human rights organizations work with a network of contacts inside Iran to try to document every case. Kourosh Kivani. One day before the executions of the 3 young men, on Wednesday, March 18th, the Iranian regime hanged Kourosh Kivani. He had dual nationality, Iranian and Swedish. He was executed under the accusation of espionage in favor of the Israeli government. He is the 3rd executed in 2026 for that reason, according to the NGO Iran Human Rights. The Swedish foreign minister declared that the legal process was not legally sound. The European Union condemned the execution. The Iranian regime did not respond to any of the international protests. To understand why these executions are so serious, you need to understand how the Iranian judicial system works when the regime decides to use it as a weapon of repression. The process that these cases followed has a name: summary trials, juicios express. And it works like this. A person is detained, generally in mass arrests, during or after a protest. They are taken to a detention center, sometimes official, sometimes improvised. There they can spend days, weeks, even months without access to a trusted lawyer. According to multiple testimonies documented by Amnesty International and other organizations, detainees are subjected to intense pressure to sign confessions. Those confessions are later broadcast on state television as proof of their guilt. When the trial arrives, it is before a court that does not admit exculpatory evidence, that does not guarantee the right to a real defense, and that dictates a sentence in a matter of hours or days. The entire process is designed not to do justice, but to produce a predetermined result. The charge of moharebeh, enmity against God, is especially useful for the regime because it is extraordinarily vague. It can be applied to almost any act of resistance. And its penalty is death. Amnesty International summarized it in a few words. These resembled nothing like a real trial. They were accelerated procedures in which confessions obtained through torture were used to justify executions whose purpose was political, not judicial. The Iranian legal monitor Dadban added that the convicts lacked effective access to independent lawyers, and that, under these conditions, the use of the death penalty amounts to an extrajudicial execution. There is a very recent and very painful precedent that is worth remembering here. In 2020, the Iranian wrestler Navid Afkari was executed despite a massive international campaign calling for his pardon. He was 27 years old. He was hanged after being convicted on charges related to previous protests, also under the charge of Moharebe. The International Olympic Committee, athletes from all over the world, European governments, everyone asked for clemency. The regime listened to no one. 6 years later, history repeats itself. The 19-year-old wrestler Saleh Mohammadi suffered the same fate. And again, the world protested. And again, the regime ignored the protests. Because for the regime, these executions are not a mistake. They are a message. Why does the Iranian regime execute young people in the middle of a war that already has it busy enough? The answer is a single word: fear. Mahmoud Amiri Moghadam, director of the Oslo-based organization Iran Human Rights, explained it clearly. These executions are carried out to sow fear in society. The Islamic Republic knows that the main threat to its survival does not come from the United States or Israel. It comes from the Iranian people. It is a sentence worth repeating, because it is the key to everything that is happening. For the Iranian regime, American missiles are dangerous. Israeli bombs are devastating. But the existential threat, the one that can truly end the Islamic Republic as we know it, is the people filling the streets of Tehran shouting, "Death to the dictator." And that is why, even in the middle of a war that is killing generals and destroying military bases, the regime continues to find time and resources to maintain internal repression. Because for them, the two wars are connected: the external and the internal. Behnam Ben Taleblu, senior fellow on Iran at the Foundation for Defense of Democracies in Washington, formulated it this way in an interview with CNN. Tehran openly crossed Trump's red line regarding the executions of protesters as an act of defiance against the West. Iran is also sending a message that it remains impervious to pressure, whether foreign or domestic. It is a double defiance to its external enemies and to its own population. The executions also function as a warning to the more than 50,000 detainees still in Iranian prisons. The message is, if you think you can resist, look at what happens to those who try to fight. The head of the Iranian judiciary, Gholam Hossein Mohseni Ejei, was even more explicit. He said publicly in January, "If we want to act, we must do it now. If we do it late, in 2 or 3 months, it will not have the same effect." Justice as a tool for the engineering of fear. Execute fast, execute in public, execute with known names and faces, like athletes, so that the message reaches everyone. That is the calculation. What we have seen this week may be only the beginning. The organization Iran Human Rights has documented at least 27 death sentences specifically issued against people detained during the January protests. These are 27 confirmed sentences. But the figure that alarms experts the most is another one. More than 100 people are currently facing charges that can carry the death penalty. And Iranian state media have broadcast hundreds of recorded confessions of detainees admitting to crimes punishable by death. Those televised confessions have a double purpose. On one hand, they serve as propaganda to justify the convictions before Iranian public opinion. On the other hand, they are in themselves a form of public torture. The detainees who appear on camera know they are signing their own death warrant. The scenario that human rights organizations fear is that of a wave of mass executions taking advantage of the umbrella of the war. The logic is terrifying but clear. When the world is looking at missiles over the Indian Ocean, when the headlines talk about B-52 bombers and the Strait of Hormuz, there is less attention available for what happens inside Iranian prisons. The war, in that sense, can be a convenient screen to accelerate executions. Amnesty International warned in a statement, the context of the war with the United States and Israel serves as cover for a repression that would otherwise generate greater international pressure. And there is another factor that complicates the situation even more: the new Iranian leadership. Following the death of Ayatollah Ali Khamenei on February 28th, his son Mojtaba Khamenei was designated as the new supreme leader. He is a man much less known internationally, about whom relatively little is known. What is known is that he needs to demonstrate authority, he needs to earn the respect of the most hardline sectors of the regime, and he needs to send a signal that the Islamic Republic is not in retreat. The executions this week fit perfectly into that script of asserting power. What is happening now is not new. It is part of a pattern that repeats itself in Iran every time there is a major crisis. Iran is the country with the second highest number of executions in the world, only behind China. Last year, according to data from Iran Human Rights, the regime hanged at least 1,500 people, approximately one every 6 hours. But when there are massive protests, that number goes up. During the 2022 protests, triggered by the death of Mahsa Amini at the hands of the morality police, the regime executed at least 12 people directly related to the demonstrations, and thousands of detainees spent months in prison under conditions that Amnesty International documented as systematic torture. During the regional conflict of June 2025, it executed 13 people under charges related to the war context. And now, during the largest protests since the 1979 revolution, the number of death sentences related to protesters already far exceeds previous episodes. There is a historical parallel that specialists cite time and again. In 1988, the Iranian regime carried out mass executions of political prisoners. Estimates speak of between 3,000 and 5,000 people executed in a matter of months. It was one of the largest political massacres of the 20th century in that region, and it went almost completely ignored by the world. Those who study these cycles warn. When the regime feels its survival is threatened, from within and from without at the same time, it historically tends to intensify internal repression, not soften it. The international community has reacted, but the question everyone is asking is whether that reaction is worth anything. The United States Department of State had expressly asked that Saleh Mohammadi not be executed. Iran ignored it. The European Union condemned the executions. Iran did not respond. Sweden protested the execution of its citizen Kourosh Kivani. The regime did not flinch either. In the world of sports, the reaction was especially intense. The execution of the wrestler Mohammadi provoked a wave of condemnations among athletes, former coaches, and former wrestlers from all over the world. The International Olympic Committee and the World Wrestling Federation, United World Wrestling, were asked to take stronger measures, up to the exclusion of Iran from international competitions. So far, the responses from these organizations have been considered insufficient by activists. The UN Special Rapporteur on Iran has called for the executions to cease. The Security Council, paralyzed by the usual vetoes, cannot act. And inside Iran, the fear that the regime wanted to sow seems to be taking effect, at least in part. The protests that reached a point of paralyzing the country in January are largely stifled. The streets are quiet. Not because people agree with the regime, but because they know what can happen to them if they go out again. An analysis by the Elcano Royal Institute describes the pattern with precision. The Iranian regime has learned to calibrate its repression. It does not always use maximum force, because that has international costs that are too high. But it uses enough force at the right moment so that people stay home. The executions this week are part of that calculation. What I am telling you does not appear in the major headlines. If you believe that this type of information should reach more people, share this video. It is the best way to support this channel. Let's try to see the full picture, because what is happening in Iran these weeks has several layers that need to be understood together. First layer, the external war. The United States and Israel have been bombing Iran for more than 3 weeks. They have killed the supreme leader. They have destroyed thousands of military targets. They have significantly degraded Iranian military capabilities, but they have not overthrown the regime. Second layer, the internal war. Inside Iran, there are tens of thousands of people in prisons for having protested. There are 100 or more with death sentences hanging over them. And the regime has just demonstrated, with this week's executions, that it is not going to release those people or forgive their treason. On the contrary, third layer, the new leadership. Mojtaba Khamenei, the new supreme leader, needs to establish his authority. In a regime like Iran's, authority is established, among other things, by showing that you are capable of exercising power with toughness. This week's executions are also a declaration of intent from the new leadership. Fourth layer, time is working against the common people. The longer the external war lasts, the more difficult it is for the world to pay attention to what is happening inside Iran. Journalists are covering missiles and bombings. Governments are busy with oil prices and the Strait of Hormuz. And in that vacuum of attention, the regime can continue executing. What could happen now? The most likely scenario, and the most disturbing one, is an acceleration of executions in the coming weeks. The regime has more than 100 people with capital charges. It has a judicial system designed to produce quick convictions. And it has a political incentive to keep sending messages of strength both inward and outward. The alternative scenario is that international pressure, combined with the damages of the war, leads the regime to make some gesture of moderation. But the recent history of Iran suggests that this is unlikely when power feels threatened. What is clear is that the Iranian people are caught between two fires: the bombings from outside that destroy infrastructure, and the repression from within that destroys lives. Do you believe the international community is doing enough to protect Iranian protesters? Leave me your opinion in the comments. This is exactly the type of debate that I am interested in reading here. I am going to end by returning to where we started. Saleh Mohammadi was 19 years old. He had just turned 19 8 days before they hanged him. He was an athlete. He was the kind of young man who, in any other country in the world, would have an entire life ahead of him, full of competitions, victories, a family, and a future. He went out into the street because he couldn't pay his rent, because the money he had saved was worth nothing, because he was fed up with a system that promised him dignity and gave him misery. And that is why he died. The Iranian regime says he was a murderer. The surveillance cameras that his lawyer tried to present to the court said something else. The court refused to see them. There is a quote from the director of Iran Human Rights that has been spinning in my head since I read it, and I believe it summarizes everything we are seeing. The main threat to the survival of the Islamic Republic does not come from American missiles. It comes from the Iranian people themselves. That is why they execute. That is why they put tens of thousands of people in prison. That is why they cut off the internet when protests begin. Because they know that if people could organize freely, without fear, the regime would not last. And while the world debates military strategies and oil prices, inside Iranian prisons, there are more than 100 people waiting to find out if a death sentence will reach them. None of them have names in the major headlines. None of them appear in geopolitical analyses. But all of them are real people, with families waiting for them, with dreams that the regime is stealing from them. This has not ended. And what is coming could be much worse. We will continue reporting on what happens, because these stories deserve to be told. And the people who go out into the street, risking their lives, deserve for someone from here, where we can speak freely, to tell the story of what is happening. If this video has opened your eyes to something you didn't know, share it. Not to grow the channel, but because this story needs more people to know it. See you in the next video.